Hello, my name is Larry Stevens, and I'm the director of the Spring Stewardship Institute at the Museum of Northern Arizona in Flagstaff. And today, along with my co-authors Jeff Janess and Jerry Ledbetter, I'd like to share with you information we've been gathering about the distribution and status of Colorado River Basin springs and springs-dependent species in the state of Nevada. Springs are ecosystems where groundwater reaches and usually flows from the Earth's surface. So these are subsurface to surface linked groundwater dependent ecosystems. What makes them very interesting in this arid region is that they're hotspots of biodiversity. We estimate that more than 10% of the endangered species in the U.S. are springs and spring-specific taxa. And in addition, there are many rare and endemic and undescribed species occurring at springs. Springs are keystone ecosystems, which are highly ecologically interactive points in the landscape with great cultural, historic, and economic significance. Springs are everywhere gravely threatened by human activities, but the good news is they can be sustainable and restorable if the aquifer is intact. Nevada Springs work that we're doing is an effort supported by the Nevada Division of Natural Heritage and the EPA and several other organizations, including TNC and NDOW in Nevada. And the work we're doing is to map the springs across the state and better understand their ecology. Today, I'll be talking about our efforts to understand differences between springs and different drainage basins within the state of Nevada. I'll look at contrasting springs and springs biota between the Colorado River Basin springs that are in Nevada and the rest of the state, and looking at the distribution, the ecohydrology, and the distribution of species. Then asking the question, does basin connectivity influence endemism and biodiversity, and if so, how? And then lastly, also mentioning the ecological and conservation status of Colorado River Basin and Nevada springs and springs-dependent species. So first, the Colorado River Basin is an enormous 250,000 square mile drainage basin off to the east of Nevada, in Utah, Arizona predominantly, and New Mexico and Colorado. This river basin is a vast terrain, great topographic diversity. It is politically and ecologically divided into the Colorado Plateau, the upper Colorado River Basin, and the the lower Colorado River Basin in the Basin and Range geologic province, with the intervening transition valleys. This is the main water source for the Southwest, supporting providing water and power for nearly 40 million people. The Colorado River Basin supports almost 21,000 reported springs, with perhaps more than 330 springs-dependent taxa. It's got moderate to high levels of impairment of its springs, as do many springs in the Southwest. Now, the portion of the Colorado River Basin that drains Nevada is actually fairly substantial. It's about 11%. It matches about the area of the Humboldt River drainage, and it's second only to the central basins of Nevada. Note that there are about 15 different drainage basins in Nevada, or hydrologic areas within Nevada, and Nevada making up more than 250,000 square kilometers. The Colorado River Basin occupies about 11% of the state, so it's a substantial portion of the state of Nevada. By going through lots and lots of information about the distribution of springs on various reports and talking with many experts, we've begun to compile the distribution of springs in Nevada through this project I've been talking about. This is our third of the fourth year in the project. From the literature, initially we had about 4,200 springs reported. As we gathered more information, that number jumped to more than 25,000, and we estimate now there may be more than 27,000 springs overall in the state. Of those, about 4,000 or 15% have been looked at for some purpose or other: hydrology, geochemistry, in some cases for the biota at them. Within the Colorado River Basin portion of the state, we have reported 1,153 springs. This is about 4.5% of Nevada's springs. So given that this portion of the landscape occupies 11% of the state, but only has less than 5% of the springs, that suggests that springs in this region are more isolated than those elsewhere in the state. Of the springs in this portion of the state, we've inventoried 312 to some level. Not too many of them really ecologically, but about 22% of the springs in this landscape at least have been visited and verified. Now, if we plot the number of springs in the state against the basin area of those 15 basins we were talking about, we see that it forms a kind of a rough line of distribution. As area increases, the number of springs increases. That's to be expected. But the Colorado River Basin is an outlier in this, but with relatively few springs reported in the landscape. If you took this point out of this graph, the coefficient of regression would jump pretty substantially and be more precise. So the density of springs in the Colorado River Basin appears to be markedly lower than that in the rest of the state. What kinds of springs exist in Nevada? Well, we just published a paper last week on this classifying spring ecosystem types in ecological applications. Both the state of Nevada and the Colorado River Basin in Nevada have the same array of spring types, more or less. Most of the springs are springs that emerge in established channels. I've depicted those in a cartoon down below here. And then there are also a fair number of wet meadow helicrene springs, as well as a fair number of hill slope springs. That doesn't differ too much in these two landscapes. Where differences are showing up is in the discharge in geochemistry. Springs inside the Colorado River Basin are on average larger, 3 to 4 times greater in flow than those in the rest of the state. Now, granted, these kind of graphs using the mean values are going to be distorted by a few very large springs, like Ash Springs and some of the Moapa warm springs. And so, but even comparing the medians, there's still a twice as high median value for springs discharge inside the Colorado River Basin as there is in the state. So flow is larger at some of these springs. The water temperature is warmer at springs in the Colorado River Basin than it is outside the Colorado River Basin within the state of Nevada. That is interesting and logical, given that we have some very long flow paths in the Colorado River Basin. We're talking about the White River drainage system. Several hundred kilometers of flow. The water, the residence time of groundwater there may be more than 10,000 years. The more times the groundwater is underground, the longer, the more solutes is able to pick up. So, and that's also reflected in the conductance values down below, which are higher in the Colorado River Basin springs. So temperature and conductance show us that we've got more minerally enriched and warmer water in these springs. Those are actually stressful for life. They put a selective disadvantage on most species. So species that are colonizing these kind of habitats go through a bit more rigorous evolutionary process than those that are trying to live in cool water and low ion concentration waters. So let's actually look at some of these species. First the plants. We find a greater than expected richness of Colorado River Basin springs dependent taxa of plants, and that's I'll explain that a little bit here. It's interesting that there's a relatively low richness of sensitive wetland plants throughout the Southwest, and this is reflected in the Nevada Division of Natural Heritage's list of sensitive species for the state of Nevada. There are only 19 of 376 Nevada sensitive plants that are springs dependent. It's about 5% of the overall sensitive flora, and a much smaller percentage of the overall flora. However, within the Colorado River Basin, 9 of those 19, or nearly 50%, exist in the Colorado River Basin. Again, even though that is a fairly small portion of the overall state landscape. There's a larger question of why are there so few sensitive wetland and springs-dependent plant species overall. That's a good topic for a PhD. Here's a few examples of highly endemic species like Botrychium frenulata and Angelica scabrita in the Spring Mountains portion of the Colorado River Basin, and then a widespread species Eustoma exaltum that shows up occasionally as well. So plants, there are more springs-dependent plant species in this portion of Nevada than expected. Things get quite exciting in terms of the levels of endemism when we start to look at spring snails. Spring snails are a conservation topic for this region, and we've got 18 species within the Colorado River Basin portion of the state of Nevada. That's about 21% of Nevada's overall 83 species. Again, 21% of the snails occurring on 11% of the landscape means there's an enriched level of spring snails living in this portion of the state springs. These are tiny snails, many highly adapted to the habitats in which they live, and more than 72% of those that live in the Colorado River Basin are endemic. So that's quite substantial. Some of these species, like the blue point spring snail, occur just at a single or a few sites. So spring snail richness is quite elevated in the Colorado River Basin portion of this state. In terms of insects, other invertebrates, we have a host of rare, unusual, and sometimes endemic invertebrates that live in the Colorado River Basin portion of the state. There's not that much attention has been paid to the insects that live at springs. The family Nocoridae and the aquatic true bugs has a couple of very impressive representatives, and the dryopoid lone-toed riffle beetles also are well represented as endemics. One butterfly looks to be endemic to springs in the region. There's much more to learn about this, but again, looks like nicely elevated levels of endemism among aquatic insects at springs. The story, of course, with fish is quite important in Nevada. We have so many springs-dependent native fish in the state of Nevada. A total of 17 species show up in this landscape in the Colorado River Basin. That's 28% of the 61 Nevada native species, again showing up in 11% of the landscape. The genera like Chronychthes have multiple subspecies. Several of the genera, Rhynichthes is in the same situation, that show up at one or just a few springs in the state. A unique genus of dace, the Moapa dace, shows up at just in the Moapa Warm Springs area. In addition to these, there are 5 mainstream Colorado River fish that are in the landscape. So it's quite an array of fish. Much higher concentration of fish here in this portion of the state than expected. Well, there are also several other vertebrates in the landscape that are restricted to this portion of the state. 8 species of amphibians. That's 61% of all amphibians in Nevada occur in the Colorado River Basin. One of the species, the relic leopard frog, which was once considered to be extinct, has been rediscovered around the shore of Lake Mead. So we have good examples of endemism even among the amphibians, and much higher than expected concentration of those species in this portion of the state. Note that the American bullfrog is a non-native species in this landscape, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. Only one species of mammal, taxon of mammal that's springs dependent. That's the Pahranagat Valley montane vole. It's not really too likely that we run into to mammals or birds that are endemic to springs, but at least we have one example there. So an great array of native endemic species in this portion of Nevada's landscape. There are also many non-native species here. Non-native plants like palms and tamarisk that are highly invasive. A great number of great densities of non-native other mollusca like quagga mussel, New Zealand spring snail, melanoides snails, as well as non-native fish, aquarium fish that have been released, and Gambusia, the mosquito fish that's been widely released to not control mosquitoes. Many game fish also have been released in the landscape. Louisiana red crayfish are abundant, as are bullfrogs in some settings. That's not to mention feral equines and livestock that are also strongly affecting many of the springs in this portion of the state. So in response to these conservation issues, we developed the Spring Stewardship Institute at the Museum of Northern Arizona, and are collaborating with a number of agencies to improve understanding of springs and how to manage them better. We provide inventories, information, assistance with data organization, archive, and as well as trainings and workshops and symposia. We're going to have a symposium and workshop in June 2021. Please get a hold of us if you're interested, springstewardshipinstitute.org. And we provide agency advisement as well as on-the-ground rehabilitation to address some of these issues and improve understanding of springs as ecosystems and their management. And we do this by creating have created a wonderful database. It's very easy to use, but it allows us to be able to relate many different variables in terms of understanding what's going on at an individual spring. This database also includes the ability to assess the ecological integrity of springs, and we can generate this kind of graph in which we can plot the ecological integrity of springs in the whole state or within the Colorado River Basin against their ecological risk. These graphs are not terribly different. More data here may make this graph look a bit more like that of the whole state. Nonetheless, this is a useful way to find out which springs, especially those in the center of these plots, where a little bit of management attention might reduce the risk and improve the ecological condition. And so those are kind of the best bang for the buck in terms of management. All right, so with that, I'd like to conclude that it's been a pleasure speaking with you today about Colorado River Basin and Nevada Springs. These springs in the Colorado River Basin are more isolated. They differ geochemically, and they support higher than expected springs-dependent plant, spring snail, insect, and amphibian richness and endemism. These springs have increased paleo and modern hydrologic connectivity, despite the contemporary spatial isolation. And they impose geochemical stresses. Those factors are probably largely responsible for the increased endemism in Colorado River Basin springs within the state of Nevada. Long-term hydraulic connectivity, Holocene isolation, and enriched geochemistry, therefore, have contributed to this pattern. However, threats abound and impairment levels to springs are very high. So Nevada springs warrant focused management attention to ensure their sustainability for the future. Thank you very much.